Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this exciting event. My name is Jose Morales. I am the Deputy Voter Protection Director at Fireside Action. Right now, we are deep in the throes of Freedom to Vote fall, and our mission is very clear. We are demanding that senators pass the provisions outlined in two key bills that have come up, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, immediately. And so tonight's fireside chat will focus on the connection between democracy at the voting booth and in the workplace, and the role of organized labor in the fight to protect our freedom to vote. This event couldn't be more perfectly timed, and not just because it's sweater season and not because Adele's new song came out, but because there is some breaking news from earlier today that Leader Schumer plans to hold a vote on that first bill I mentioned, the Freedom to Vote Act, next week. This is exciting stuff, y'all, all of the above. So I know you came here to hear from two extremely important and visionary leaders, so let's get it going. Tonight, I am thrilled to be introducing you and to be joined by Fireside Action founder Stacey Abrams and AFL-CIO President Liz Shuler. President Shuler is the first woman and youngest person ever elected president of the 57 unions and 12.5 million members of the AFL-CIO. She's worked her way up as an IBEW organizer and is leading through decades of experience to grow a bold, inclusive movement for all working people. And we are so honored to have you here tonight, President Shuler. With that, I'm going to pass this proverbial mic over to Leader Abrams to take it away.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you to everyone who's watching tonight. President Shuler, it is a pleasure to be able to refer to you as such. And I'm just so honored to be in this conversation. As we begin this fireside chat, I want to ask you to think about and talk a little bit about the historic role that not only labor, but the AFL-CIO has played in voting rights. When I think about the work of Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, the AFL-CIO has always been not just at the table, but in the streets when it comes to the work of voting rights. Can you talk about why it is so vital to not only the nation, but specifically to the labor movement to be a part of the voting rights fight?
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you to you, Leader Abrams, because you are a shero to so many, and the work that you've been doing to raise our voices and make sure that every vote counts has been remarkable. And I am so honored to be fighting right alongside you. And you're right, the labor movement has been there throughout time, throughout history, and often we aren't seen that way. I think people think of the labor movement as, fighting for labor rights in the workplace, but we are a social movement. We are engaged in social justice, and voting rights is the pathway to get the change that we need in so many different arenas. And when I think of, the importance of voting rights in our democracy and voting and workplace rights, they go hand in hand, because our country was founded and built upon, engagement and participation in the democratic process. And the right to vote is, of course, central to who we are. And it translates into so many aspects of our systems and our culture. And that includes the labor movement and our workplaces. And I think, every worker wants to have a say and a voice in how their workplace functions and the policies that come down from the bosses. And so that's where unions intersect with this notion of us having a place at that table and being able to elect the people who can make the change, whether that's in our society politically or in our unions. So they're very much intertwined. And you mentioned Bayard Rustin, the great civil rights leaders who have been fighting for our rights, both inside and outside of labor, along with the civil rights movement. And, voting rights has always been central to the mission and goals of the labor movement.
When we think about what's before Congress, and Jose announced the extraordinary news that Leader Schumer intends to call for a cloture vote next week regarding the Freedom to Vote Act, one of the reasons this has become so pivotal is, as you said, our social justice rights are wrapped into this conversation. But there's a lot of impatience and there is a great deal of worry. Can you talk a little bit about your history in labor organizing and what you bring from that to this fight, this unfortunately long-term fight that we have for protecting voting rights, and what we can all learn or be reminded of from labor and the work of organizers?
Sure. And I got my start in the electrical workers. As was said earlier, Jose mentioned that I came up through a union, a very male dominated union, but women, of course, now are, well, before the pandemic, we were about half the workforce. As you know, women have left the workforce for so many reasons, during the pandemic. But I think what people don't realize is that the labor movement is the largest organization of working women in the country. And we represent 6.5 million women who are activists in their workplaces and out in the streets, leading protests and fighting for our democracy. So as I came up through the electrical workers, it was not something that I saw, right? We didn't have as many women leaders in our union. And so fast forward to today, I see the importance of, women attaining those leadership positions, being out in front in these fights to inspire other women to organize and get more active and play more central roles in these social justice fights and our fights for our democracy. So it was personal for me. I started out as an organizer. I was organizing clerical workers, and we saw at the electric utility company the same types of intimidation and harassment that many workers see when they try to form a union. I was involved in organizing clerical workers who weren't in the union, whereas the power linemen were in the IBEW. So when we tried to organize and get the same amount of respect and recognition and really, it was about a voice at work more than it was about some of the other issues. The company came at us with everything it had, and they held the captive audience meetings, and they intimidated this largely group of women workers who basically just wanted the same thing that the mainly male workforce had on the power lineman side. So I learned a lot in that organizing campaign because, again, this is about workplace democracy. This is about having your voice heard. This is about having a seat at the table, and to be able to have a union where we can collectively band together and have more power is what sparked my interest in being a part of the labor movement. And I haven't looked back since. I made my way up through the IBEW, and now here I am at the AFL-CIO.
Part of what I think about when we talk about the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, we tend to think about these things in these very large, esoteric, philosophical ways, that this is about voting rights and democracy. But it's also about the very granular conversations. Where does your kid go to school? Do you get paid a living wage? Do you have access to health care? And the way we secure those rights, the way we solve those everyday problems is our ability to elect leaders who care about these things with us. Can you talk a bit about why you see the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act as essential to the bread and butter issues that we know families are facing?
No, absolutely. And what's really frustrating is all those things you mentioned are the things we voted for in the last election. We actually fought so hard to get that pro-worker majority in the House and in the Senate, thanks to Georgia. And of course, in the White House with President Biden and Vice President Harris, to really usher in that change that people are so hungry for. And so when you went down that list of all the the issues that matter to working people and people in this country, that really we did come to the polls to make that change through the electoral process. And working people came out in incredible numbers. And we fought right alongside our allies and partners like Fair Fight Action to make sure that all the votes were counted, and that, that our voices were heard, and that we elected the people who could deliver the change. And so what's really frustrating right now is that we need to democratize the US Senate, because we now have, this barrier in front of us to the change that we all desperately want so much. So that's, I guess, what I'm thinking about when I think about the agenda that's in front of us, the opportunity we have in front of us with these big investments, that the promise that we could have investments to help attack climate change, to help create jobs, a whole new era of job creation for our country, and investments in our infrastructure. And so that's what I hear from working people when I'm talking to people that are in workplaces, and when I'm out mobilizing and canvassing, is that people are they're fed up, they're ready for change, and they want to see the investments that they voted for in 2020 become a reality.
So what's your call to action for them? What do you think the folks who are they're becoming convinced that it's not worth it? What do you want them to hear about what's happening, what you're seeing every day, what we're all working on?
Well, I think here we are, right? That the U.S. Senate needs to hear from us. And for people who are frustrated like me, the way to do that is by exercising your voice and making sure that you are picking up that phone and getting out into your communities and talking to your friends, because I think there's a lack of information, to be honest, about what is at stake in especially in these investments that we're talking about. People are tossing around different numbers of 3.5 trillion, 1.5 trillion. No, this is about our future. This is about investing in infrastructure and childcare and elder care. And you think about, what the pandemic laid bare, and that is the cracks in our safety net and our systems, like our care system, where women left the workforce because they didn't have reliable systems of care. And so in order for us to actually go to work, we need to have that dependable childcare and care for our older Americans and differently abled. And so I think this is the moment, right, where we have this big opportunity in front of us, and we just have to reach out and grab it. And it depends on us. It depends on our voices, our ability to mobilize, our ability to get our friends, families, neighbors, communities engaged, and to not be sitting back, waiting for the change, but to be out in front demanding it.
Right. Well, before I came to this call, I was watching the news, and two of the lead stories are the strike happening with John Deere, the potential strike with Kellogg, and the potential strike with IATSE and the film industry. Can you talk a bit about how we connect these fights for democratic rights to the right to work laws in so many states that will not permit unions to form and people to stand up for what they need for these very issues you're talking about? So give us a little history lesson on right to work, but more importantly, on how this connects to what we're working on today.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the strikes, because we are definitely in a moment, right, where I think the hashtag that's going around Twitter is Striketober. We have not seen this level of activism, workers standing up, exercising their power in a very long time. We have 30 strikes going on as we speak. And you mentioned the IA, the Stage and Theatrical Union, 60,000 workers in film and television production could be going on strike on Monday, and they voted already. Over 90% of the membership voted to authorize this strike. That says a lot. And especially I know in your area, in Atlanta, I know is very dependent on that industry. So this is about workers. As I said, the economy is not working for working people, and they're fed up. They worked overtime through this pandemic to get our country back on track, to make sure that the services were being delivered and the patients were being taken care of. And all they want is a measure of respect and to be acknowledged, appreciated, paid, and protected. And so that's what we're talking about with this activism that we're seeing, and the fact that people are sick and tired of being treated the way they have been when corporations are making record profits. And, the system that we're in is so badly broken. And speaking of broken systems, labor laws in this country are badly broken. And, you mentioned right to work. We have a bill in Congress now called the PRO Act that would actually restore a worker's right and freedom to come together collectively and organize a union. And as we stand right now, corporations and politicians have chipped away at the law over time so that it's nearly impossible to form a union now without fear of being harassed or intimidated or bullied or even fired. And so that's how we connect back to the importance of getting out the vote and making sure that our votes are counted and electing the officials that will listen to us and hear us and stand up and fight for the reforms and the change that we need. And the PRO Act, of course, is central to that because it will allow for workers to, again, come together in a union without fear. And what we're seeing right now is companies will do anything they can to intimidate workers and have that chilling effect in the workplace to make sure that they put up every barrier they can to get in the way of workers exercising their rights. We saw it with Amazon. That's a campaign that was very much on America's mind because it was in the press, the conditions that Amazon workers were facing. And the company went so far as to actually change the timing of a stoplight outside of their warehouse so workers wouldn't be able to talk to union organizers on their way out of the plant. So the PRO Act would put an end to that employer intimidation, the captive audience meetings they hold, the tactics that they use, because there are really no enforcement or penalties right now in the current law, and the PRO Act would change that. And so to get the PRO Act passed, we need to make sure that our elected officials are responding to us and that we're continuing to put the pressure on them through all of the democratic levers that we have in front of us.
And just to tie this together, we know that in states like Missouri and Ohio and in Wisconsin, as we saw a ramping up of voter suppression, we saw an erosion of workers' rights. And with the permanent inculcation of these new laws that are putting in place, election subversion, voter suppression for another generation, that's also an opportunity for local state elected officials to continue to chip away at workers' rights. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so important that we look to the federal government to create a uniform system of voting, which is what the Freedom to Vote Act does? It doesn't say every state has to do everything the same way, but it sets minimum standards so that no matter where you live, you have access to the right to vote. Can you talk a little bit about how that connects to the state laws we're seeing and these state actions we're seeing that really we're trying to respond to with these voting rights laws?
Well, all I know is that the same people who are attacking voting rights are the same people who are attacking union rights. It's no secret that they're all in this together and they've got a playbook, right? Our enemies. So what we've seen at the state level, as you just went through, and really the question, I should be asking you this question because you have so much more depth in terms of what you're seeing state by state by state. But I think the idea here is that workers who are facing the attacks in their efforts to form a union are essentially being, the same people are attacking our rights at the ballot box. And so I think the remedy here is yet again that we can't be sitting idly by and wait for something to happen, but it's about the activism, the engagement, the education, making sure people are getting the right information. And I think in this era of misinformation, disinformation, where we're all kind of in our bubbles, that we need those trusted sources that have the credibility, that have, the facts. Oh my gosh, can we actually use facts in this day and age, right? And we believe that the labor movement, along with our community partners, are the place where people can get that trusted information. And as you said, we should be making it easier for people to vote, not more difficult, and have a baseline standard, a consistency, so that there isn't this Byzantine, approach in state by state by state. So I think that symmetry that we're looking for, so that it's clear, it's available, accessible to everyone. And that's what the labor movement believes in, is freedom for folks to access their rights, exercise them, have them be protected, and actually have their votes be counted, right? And so I think that's what the goal that we share.
Well, I think this is a great time to once again emphasize the importance of calling your senators, because as we move towards this call to action by Leader Schumer, so often we think about our politics in terms of what happens in Washington. But for so many of our lives, as you know, the harm happens at the state and local level. And what is so important about the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is that these two acts use the federal power that we all collectively hold as citizens, and says that no matter which state you live in, your right to vote shouldn't be impugned and impeded. And I think that's the similar goal of the PRO Act, this idea that labor has always had, that it shouldn't matter where you are, your right to work, not work for less, but your right to work and to enjoy the fruits of your labor are so important. Can you talk a little bit about why we have to keep the local part of this in mind?
Well, I was thinking back to Georgia. I mean, this is, something we've talked about quite often, that your state was a laboratory for the playbook that is taking place all across this country, that our enemies want to see disenfranchisement happen. And it's no secret that, as I said earlier, the folks that don't want to see unions take hold in Georgia are the same people that are, suppressing the vote, right? Are changing the laws. And we saw that in 2020, how, as soon as the results came in and all eyes were on the Senate race in Georgia, the labor movement, of course, kicked in along with all of our allies and partners in that special election. And it became critical that we, of course, flip Georgia to blue in that moment. But what I was thinking about was the importance of the on the ground activity, and how you, Stacey, were actually the engine behind inspiring people to engage at a level that they hadn't engaged in before. And I think too about our union, Unite Here, for example, who got creative and actually, during the pandemic, when housekeepers and folks that work in the hotel and hospitality industry were like 90% unemployed, and they were able to turn the corner and say, hey, you know what, we should put those folks to work in bolstering our democracy and making, mobilizing communities for the election. And so I thought that was an incredible innovation where folks who were laid off or furloughed at the height of the pandemic, they weren't resigned, they organized. And they went door to door and they were canvassing and, texting and calling and, all of the tactics that we know about. But then after all the success and the runoff results, what happened right after that? 2 months later, right? The Republicans met behind closed doors and rushed the SB 202 through the legislature, right? So our work is never done. And so I think that's an example of how, we've engaged, we mobilized, and then, it's the next fight in front of us. And I think that's where we are right now. And the Voting Rights Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act are two examples of how we cannot let these barriers that we're facing stop us. And we need to keep pushing. We need to keep engaging. And we need to make sure that everyone who's listening tonight is lighting up the phone lines, contacting their senators, and making their voices heard.
President Shuler, as always, that is a perfect note to end on. And so I just want to say thank you for joining us for this conversation. And I'll hand it back to Jose.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This was an incredible conversation. President Shuler, thank you again for your time. Leader Abrams, thank you for those thoughtful and incredible questions. Y'all at home, you heard them. This is that critical moment to keep up the pressure on our senators. So call them today and every day for Freedom to Vote Fall. And you can do that by picking up your phone, dialing 833-465-7142. One more time, that's 833-465-7142. Make your first call, get connected to your senator, and leave a message about what you heard from these two incredible women leaders, President Shuler and Leader Abrams, talking about these important bills sitting in the Senate right now. You can call that number one more time to reach your second senator, 833-465-7142. Thank you, President Shuler, Leader Abrams, once more for your time and leadership. Thank you to everyone at home for celebrating Freedom to Vote Fall. Good night, and let's get it done.